welcome to one and all to the second lecture in the series, the Samuel and Althea Stroum Lectures in Jewish Studies, given this year by Professor Moshe Idel of the Hebrew University. This is now the 16th in this distinguished series of lectures. It's hard to believe, but they began in 1976, and we are now already at Lecture 16. I would also be remiss if I didn't point out that the University of Washington Press has published a number of distinguished volumes that have emerged as a result of the lectures, 6 to date, including the most recently Michael Meyer's book, Jewish Identity in the Modern World. There will, in the next few months, appear the 7th volume, and we hope that by the time Professor Idel publishes his volume with us, we will have 9. In May 1989, the Jerusalem Post, Friday weekend edition, published an article that went by the title, A Tale of Two Kabbalists. One of the Kabbalists in question was the then 42-year-old scholar of Jewish mysticism, Moshe Idel, who had emigrated to Israel from Romania when he was 16 years old. And the other was the recently deceased but still domineering figure in the study of Kabbalah, the Berlin-born Gershom Scholem. The article in question, which included a lengthy interview with Idel, described him as, quote, the first major scholar to challenge some of the most basic assumptions and definitive conclusions of Scholem. At stake, it pointed out, were issues that, quote, reach to the very heart of the modern understanding of Kabbalah from the 13th century onwards. Now, the Jerusalem Post was not the first to discover the revolutionary significance of Idel's scholarly work, though I think it would be fair to say that this article and this interview did much to publicize the growing controversy that was brewing in academy and to spread the discussion far beyond the bounds of the university. In fact, Professor Idel had recently published a comprehensive challenge to prevailing interpretations of the Jewish mystical tradition in his book, Kabbalah, New Perspectives, which was published by Yale University Press. And a first draft of this book, in fact, had been the subject of a special conference that was held at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, where, again I quote from the newspaper report, for 3 days, Idel defended his theories before 30 of North America's leading scholars of Judaica, unquote. Professor Idel's critique of the tradition of Gershom Scholem hinges, I think, on 2 general points. First, there is a question of methodology. Scholem's approach to the study of the Kabbalah could be described as historical and contextual. He understood the Kabbalah to be fundamentally a system of thought, a system of speculation, and he sought to explain it in terms of the historical context out of which it emerged. Professor Idel's approach, on the other hand, might be described as phenomenological. By that I mean he tries to understand what the symbolism and the ritual of the Kabbalah meant in and of themselves, and especially to those people who actually practiced it. This approach led him to conclude that the Kabbalah, quote, is not mainly a system of ideas, but a practical path leading towards mystical experience. This, in his view, is what Kabbalah meant to those who actually practiced it. Secondly, there is a difference of opinion on the origins of the Kabbalah and of its place in the history of Judaism. Scholem had argued that the Kabbalah entered Judaism as the result of an encounter between 2nd century rabbinic Judaism and Greek Gnosticism. Thus, It could be viewed as having operated throughout Jewish history as a kind of alien heresy, a subversive stream to normative Jewish thought and practice. Idel, on the other hand, denies that the Kabbalah went against the grain of rabbinic Judaism. Rather, the wellsprings of Jewish mysticism were to be found themselves in an esoteric tradition that flowed, as he says, from the inner recesses of Judaism itself. According to Professor Idel, the study of Hebrew manuscripts dealing with the Kabbalah has only just begun. As a result, the scholarly world is not yet in a position to assess the Kabbalah's ultimate meaning. What he is certain of, however, is that even the most theoretical texts of Jewish mysticism have as their origin, have as their goal, experience itself, the mystical experience. I quote from Professor Idel, "It's important for academic scholars of Kabbalah to understand what it means to live Kabbalah. These texts were written by and for people who attempted to be aware in every movement they made, in every thought they had, of the effect they were causing on high, according to the map that had been drawn for them by the Kabbalah." His interest in the experiences that lay behind Kabbalistic texts has led him to try to reconstruct actual techniques used by Jewish mystics to obtain direct knowledge and experience of the divine. And among these, in his works, you will find such actions as mystical weeping, or meditation on the letters of God's name, or the visualization of colors, and the ascent of the soul while dreaming. Professor Idel learns much about the Kabbalah through direct observation of mystical practices in the ultra-Orthodox communities in Israel. It's interesting to note also that they apparently do not hesitate to learn from him. More than one Haredi group has turned to Professor Idel in order that he elucidate for them the contents of Kabbalistic manuscripts and writings. In his first lecture, Professor Idel referred to Pardes as the danger zone of religious experience. He proposed that a transformation had taken place during the Middle Ages, according to which Judaism went from being an exoteric religion of the collectivity, based on the fulfillment of norms that are equally accessible to everyone, to an esoteric religion of the spiritual elite, who sought to achieve a more perfect knowledge or a more fundamental experience than that which emerged from the normative tradition. And he traced this development from the point of view of the study of philosophy, with specific reference to the writings of Maimonides. Tonight, Professor Idel will take us on yet another path, open up another door that leads to a vista onto Pardes, this one perhaps indeed more dangerous than the one presented on Tuesday evening. The title of his lecture is Primordial Light, the Ecstatics Quest. Professor Idel. Let's see. Put this there.
I shall try to discuss today another paradigm, not the philosophical one, but the ecstatical one, and I should like to open with some remarks on the importance of the term paradigm for the history of Jewish religiosity. It seems to me that the variety of paradigms which was offered by Jewish masters in the Middle Ages shows that Jews were less interested in one unified type of theology or theosophy, but they were ready to open several types of intellectual and spiritual avenues so that many people will be able to be attracted to to Judaism by selecting his own specific way. That is to say, the great variety of interpretation of the Pardes is only one sign of, I would say, of the openness of the elite to cultivate different approaches which could be absorbed by a variety of people. I don't say that they intended to attract masses, but they were interested to open the way to more than one specific type of theology. Now I shall inspect with you another form of interpretation of Pardes, which is based on two major sources. One is ancient Jewish mysticism, and the other one is Neoplatonic philosophy. Let me try to summarize a little bit the paradigm of Maimonides. It can be summarized by the Hebrew phrase used later on, Pardes HaChochma, that is to say, the Pardes of knowledge. For Maimonides, perfection was philosophy. The Pardes is the story of the cognitive problems of people trying to understand the very difficult philosophical problems in Aristotle. And the touchstone for such an achievement was Adam before the fall. Adam was immersed in contemplation of metaphysical topics. Maimonides reduced the personality of the perfect philosopher to only one important quality, and that's the intellect. This is why the major figure in Maimonides' interpretation of the Pardes story was Rabbi Akiva, that is to say, the most perfect among the four sages who entered the Pardes or the paradise. Now I shall address the pattern opened by some Kabbalists at the beginning of the 13th century. And now the major figure will be not Rabbi Akiva, who was successful to enter in Pardes and went out in peace, but Ben Azai, the Tanaitic master who died. The major assumption of this pattern is that the Pardes is not a matter of intellectual activity, but of an experience of a supreme light. That is to say, we can see a whole reinterpretation of Adam, of the paradise, of the Pardes, and of the experience in terms of light versus intellect in the paradigm of Maimonides. Really, the ancient Jewish material is very rich in emphasis on the importance of light. Maybe even the first verse of Genesis speaks about the creation of light as the first entity to be created. That's the way Rashi understood, and it seems to me representative. But even more, what's important in some Midrashic texts is the fact that Adam was portrayed as an entity of light, or as having some garments of light, which were lost after his expulsion from the paradise. According to other sources, the basic activity of Adam in the paradise was the contemplation of the light of the divine presence, or of the Shekhinah. The Hebrew term, Ziva Shekhinah, the radiance of the Shekhinah, is of paramount importance for this pattern. That is to say, the assumption in a variety of Jewish sources, Midrashic, Talmudic, and in mystical Jewish sources, the Echalot literature, is that both the Pardes and the paradise are full of light, and the most perfect experience of Adam was an experience of having garments of light and also contemplating light. Expulsion, therefore, was the loss of the possibility to contemplate the light, and also the loss of the garments of light, and instead of the light, Adam received the garment of skin. In Hebrew, it's a pun on kutonet or, with aleph and ayin that solves the whole problem. But the idea of losing this contemplation or relationship to light is crucial in a variety of ancient Jewish texts. I shall adduce only one example, which is taken basically from an apocryphic text, where we can see the attempt made by people to recuperate or to capture again this situation of contemplating light. In a relatively early book named The Book of Adam and Set, which was preserved in Armenian, I read according to the translation. But Adam, not having observed the commandments, and having been stripped of the divine light, and having been thrown outside of the garden, became an equal of the dumb beasts. And Enoch considered these things, and for 40 days, for 40 nights, he did not eat at all. That's to say, that's an attempt to balance Adam's sin. And after this, he planted a garden, and he planted in it fruit bearers. To say, an attempt to reconstruct the Garden of Eden. And I continue, and he was in that garden for 552 years, and after that, in body, he was taken up to heaven, was found worthy of the divine glory and light. End of quotation. As to say, here we have an attempt of Enoch to reconstruct, I would say, the situation of Adam. As to say, to enter again the situation of being tempted in the garden, and this is why he was able to receive again the divine glory and light. It seems to me that's the basic pattern that informed most of the discussions later. So say there was an attempt in Jewish mysticism to return to the situation of Adam as being able to become a creature of light, or to contemplate light all the time as the ideal state of being. Actually, in several texts related to the Halot literature, the idea of light is paramount. The Pardes was described as full of the radiance of light, which was contemplated by the four people. But I shall like not to enter too much in the ancient texts, but to point out to the medieval interpretation of the meaning of contemplating light. So I shall start with a manuscript text, a very short one, no more than 10 lines. And in order to describe for myself and maybe for the future readers, I had to spend some 60 pages to analyze the few very interesting lines. I shall do it a little bit shorter. And here we can see that the earlier text in Kabbalah dealing with this idea. I don't know who the author is. It's an anonymous text which can be dated in one way or another. And here in the short text we have the whole problematic of returning to the vision of light by people who entered the Pardes. I shall discuss only one part of the text related to Ben Azai, the master who entered in the Pardes but he didn't return. So we read in a manuscript found in the Vatican Library as follows. Ben Azai peered to the Pardes, or to the, we'll see in a moment, and died. He gazed at the radiance of the divine presence, Ziva Shekhinah, like a man with weak eyes who gazes into the full light of sun, and his eyes are dimmed, and at times he becomes blinded because of the intensity of the lights which overwhelm him. So it happened to Ben Azai. The light has overwhelmed him, and he gazed at it because of his great desire to cleave to it, read the Begbo, and to enjoy without interruption. And after his cleaving to it, he did not wish to be separated from the sweet radiance, and he remained immersed and hidden within it, and his soul was crowned and adorned by that very radiance and brightness to which no one may cling and afterwards live. So I shall interrupt here the quotation, and I shall like to discuss a little bit what's going on here. We have one major transformation of ancient material by the medieval Kabbalists. People entering the Pardes are gazing, contemplating, not some lower entity, the divine chariot, or Avnei Shaish Tahor, the marble stones, but the experience is a direct experience of the radiance of God. As to say, Ziva Shekhinah represents here the major focus of the experience of the Pardes. As to say, someone entering the Pardes is encountering directly the divine light. This divine light is so strong that no one can bear, and he can die or live, but he cannot stand this experience. And this idea of the light overwhelming him is very crucial here. But in the medieval text, we have something that cannot be found in the earlier text, and that's the great desire to cleave to it. As to say, in the medieval text, we don't have the basic situation of the Echalot literature. In ancient literature, the assumption is that entering the Pardes, someone is contemplating something that's far away. Something that cannot, that the gap between man or the mystic and it cannot be bridged. There, we don't have the idea of love. In ancient Jewish mystical literature, in Echalot literature, the idea of love doesn't appear. There we have the problem of awe. To say people are overwhelmed by a certain awe, but not by love. Here we have a very radical change when the intensity of the experience is related to the great desire to cleave to the radiance of the Shekhinah. Here we have the idea, which seems to me crucial in Kabbalah. People strive for a strong experience of union with the divine. Not a matter of contemplation, not a matter of intellectual activity. It's a matter of trying to enter the divine realm and to become part of the divine realm. And that's the issue that we like to explain here. But we must be aware of something which seems to me is erotic. His great desire and his attempt to enjoy without interruption, as we shall see a little bit later, has some erotic overtone. Given the fact that Shekhinah is, in Hebrew, a feminine term, my assumption here, based upon a lot of other evidence also, that we are speaking here not only about an attempt to cleave to the divine presence, but basically to cleave to a feminine manifestation of the divine. To say a half-erotic, half-sexual relationship, if you like. That's also unique to the medieval literature, and I would say absent in ancient Jewish literature. So what happened? Because of the great desire, he didn't wish to be separated from the sweet radiance. Also, the idea of sweet radiance has some erotic quality, in my opinion. Ha'or hamatok, I would like not to enter again, but we have here something that expresses a strong experience in almost corporeal terms. So what happened to him? He remained immersed and hidden within it. That's to say, he couldn't return from the experience. The experience was so strong, his immersion in the divine light so strong that he couldn't separate. He didn't want, but also he couldn't return from this immersion. The Hebrew terms are very strong. Tavua v'ganus. To say, he simply entered the divine light in a way that he became part of it. And given the fact that any vision of the divine, according to some biblical texts, and later on in Midrash, someone dies while contemplating the divine, he had to die. And what's important here is that after his death, I'm quoting again, then his soul departed and remained there and was hidden away in the place of its cleaving, that is to say, within the radiance of the Shekhinah, of the divine presence. And this death was the death of the pious one, whose souls are separated from all concerns of the lowly world and cleave to the ways of the supernal world. To say what we have here, we have an obviously positive attitude to this mystical death. That's not a mistake. That's not, I would say, an accident, but that's an achievement. And this is why the idea of the pious is very important here. It seems to me that what we have in the description of Rabbi of Ben Azai here is a threefold issue, which is reminiscent of Christian Neoplatonic mysticism. The first phase is the phase of called in general and religious studies via purgativa. That's to say, you must purify yourself. And this concept is expressed here by the terms those who are separated from all concerns of the lowly world. As to say, at the beginning, you must enter such an experience after a certain stage of preparation and separation from the concerns of the lower world. And then the second stage you have via illuminativa, to say the idea of being illuminated by the divine. Here it's obvious. And at the end, in Christian Neoplatonism, we have via unitiva, is to say the way of union, which is also represented here in a very obvious way. So indeed we can see here how a Jewish mystic combined on one side ancient Jewish material of contemplating the divine presence, or the light of the divine presence, but on the other side, in one way or another, he's integrating material from pagan or maybe Christian Neoplatonism in order to portray the experience of Ben Azai. So this anonymous text had a long history which cannot be traced here, but in a short way, I can say it was copied at the end of the 13th century in a certain book named Otzara Kavod. And from there, he was copied in a very famous text, the commentary on the Agadot of the Talmud by Maharsha, one of the greatest 16th century figures. And from there, it invaded, if you like, 18th century Hasidism. So we are speaking here about a text, unfortunately only the manuscript, but it served as a starting point for a whole tradition which lasted for 600-700 years by informing several forms of Jewish mysticism in the 16th and 18th century. That's just one example how it's very difficult to study Kabbalah without manuscripts. Here in this small manuscript you can find the key for a long tradition which was elaborated later on. Now, what's important in another issue that seems to me crucial is that this text was, while copied, also a little bit transformed by a late 13th century Kabbalist who infused an even stronger nuance of mystical union. Already in the text I quoted, it's obvious that if you are using in Hebrew the term tavua v'ganuz, that's a strong expression of entering and remaining part of the object of your contemplation. But in the 13th century later text, you will find a much stronger formulation. Rabbi Todros Halevi Abulafia paraphrased our text in such a way. Ben Azai died because of the cleaving of his soul out of his great love, Ba'ava Rabbah, a true cleaving, that's to say, Dibuk Amiti, something that cannot be separated. And the soul didn't return because he reached a great achievement, and that's called in Hebrew Ma'ala Gdola. As to say, we have here the assumption that out of the immense love of Ben Azai, his cleaving was a total one. That's the way I'm reading the book Amiti. To say, he remained united with the divine. Later on, we have even stronger formulations of this text. For example, someone, Rabbi Moses of Kiev in Ukraine, is paraphrasing in the 16th century the same text and emphasizing that the soul of Ben Azai, she and the light became one entity. As to say, it's impossible to separate between them. This text is just one tradition dealing with the possibility to reach an experience of what's called, again, in general mysticism, unio mystica, the possibility of the soul to enter the divine realm and be totally unified. And this tradition is just one example that Jewish mysticism shared with other types of mysticism this possibility of bridging in a total manner the gap between man and God. Say, in some other studies, I brought much more evidence about the possibility to see Jewish mysticism as being deeply interested in unio mystica. That's just another example that indeed the Neoplatonic tradition, which was very formative in Christian and Islamic type of mysticism, informed also Jewish mysticism. And basically there's no reason to assume that in Christianity and Islam will have unio mystica based on Neoplatonic sources, and the Jews will, for some unknown reason, refrain from reaching the same conclusions based on the same type of text or the same types of terminology. However, in the texts related to the anonymous Kabbalists, the major event took place in the past. The major protagonist was not a contemporary 13th century Kabbalist, but Ben Azai. And the question is, what's going on here? We have a certain speculative discussion about an experience in the past, or were the Kabbalists a little bit more practical? Let's say, were they interested only to portray someone in the past as having such a mystical experience and unitive experience, or can we extract from the sources some conclusion as to the real practice of such a contemplation of light and death during such a contemplation? In my opinion, since the end of the 13th century, we have evidence, from time to time, I would say solid evidence, from time to time a little bit more dubious, if you like, that experiences of light were connected from one side to Ben Azai, on the other side with the Kabbalists who discussed the issue of Ben Azai. As to say, in my opinion, in general, I would say the Kabbalists employed the Pardes not just in order to reinterpret Jewish tradition, but also to express their own experiences. But the problem is that it's not always simple to demonstrate it. But from time to time, just as I can do it now, it's possible to see that while discussing the ancient protagonists, they are also expressing their own experience. So, for example, we learn from another anonymous Kabbalistic treatise named Sefer Sharei Tzedek, which is part of the Ecstatic Kabbalah, a book written in somewhere in the Galilee in the 90s of the 13th century. After describing the technique of reaching the experience, to say here we have exactly what type of technique was employed in order to reach such an experience. And after describing the experience, the personal experience of this Kabbalist, as to say, he describes his amazement of seeing the light and the light becoming part of himself, and how he couldn't understand what happened at the beginning, and then beginning to understand that's a real experience. Then he returns and he defines his experience in such a way. While dealing with Ben Azai, because he discusses all the other all the other figures, Ben Azai died out of the intensivity of the divine light, which attracts the light of the soul, which is weak in comparison to the divine light. As we say, here we have the assumption, which found in a lot of other texts earlier, that the human soul is basically light. The supernal, I would say, world is also light, but it's a strong light which attracts the lower soul just as a magnet is attracting iron. That's the basic assumption which tries to explain in a rather, I would say, pragmatic manner why someone is unable to separate himself after he enters such a type of experience. From my point of view, this idea of magnetic attraction is very important, because that's an attempt to express, in my opinion, something that someone experienced. It's not merely an assumption, look, Ben Azai underwent something like that. That entering this type of description is, in my opinion, using some modern anthropological terms, is to describe what can be called the ritual efficacy. As I say, by using combination of letters, which are described immediately before this text, someone is trying now to describe the effect of such a technique. And the effect is that you are uplifted, if you like, because the divine light is now attracting you, just as it happened to Ben Azai. And the human soul is weak in comparison to the divine light, because divine light is a stronger magnet. So here I have an example how one Kabbalist at least related his own experience to the experience of Ben Azai, and we can even find exactly the, I'd say, almost the date and the place where such a type of ecstatic experience happened to this person. Later on, after discussing Ben Azai, he describes this anonymous Kabbalist, his attempt to learn how to sustain the experience. He felt that he's going to die. If he's going to enter more this type of experience, he's going to die. And so he is indicating that he approached his master, I assume Abraham Abulafia, in order to teach him how to stop such a type of experience. What type of technique he may employ in order to stop the experience or to bear the experience. So at least here we can easily see that the attraction of the divine light related to Ben Azai was much more than an interpretation of ancient sources. It was an attempt to relate your experience to a model, to something that was well known to others. And in my opinion, that's not just one example. Another colleague of this Kabbalist, Rabbi Yitzchak Ofaker, another ecstatic Kabbalist, relates his own experience to Ben Azai. I shall give just a short quotation. That's in first person. I say that if a man, to say not in the past, does that which his soul wishes in the proper way of his Bodhidut, let's say using the technique of ecstatic Kabbalah, that's the meaning of the proper ways of his Bodhidut, his soul is immersed in this light, and he will die like Ben Azai. So here you can see that for him, that's, I'd say, almost a standard experience for anyone who will try to enter such a type of experience. If you use the techniques of ecstatic Kabbalah, the proper ways of his Bodhidut, of mental concentration, your soul is going to be immersed in this light and you will die like Ben Azai. As to say, end of 13th century, some 50 years after the first text dealing with this light in a theoretical manner, we can find at least two Kabbalists who would openly discuss the mystical experience of Ben Azai as something that can happen to anyone entering in the ways of ecstatic Kabbalah. What's interesting in this return to light is, in my opinion, the idea that the Kabbalists try to reach the state of the primordial man before his sin. To enter the divine light is to return to the paradise, to enter again the radiance of the Shekhinah, to become immersed, and to enter a certain type of erotic relationship with the divine presence, an issue which is later developed in the book of the Zohar in other forms. What's interesting at the end of the 13th century is that the Kabbalists supply descriptions of the techniques. As to say, in the Talmud, you don't know what happened. Now, how do you enter in the experience of light? What Ben Azai has done in order to reach such an experience. However, at the end of the 13th century, we have detailed techniques. I shall bring one example, another example, and by the letter combinations, unifications, and reversals of letters. He shall call up the tree of knowledge of good and evil, righteous knowledge and lying imagination. It's very difficult to explain the polarity of the terms. Angels of mercies and angels of destruction, witness of innocence and of guilt, and he will be in danger of the same death as Ben Azai. So say if you're entering the ecstatic Kabbalah, you're entering, I would say, a paradoxical situation where you're confronted with two alternatives. You may die, or you may become guilty and endangered. But what's important here is that we know what's the way the Kabbalists envisioned the path of entering the experience of death. Later on, beginning of 14th century, we have descriptions of Kabbalists studying together and observing each other if they became luminous. I have at least two texts related to the same Kabbalist, Yitzhak Ofacher, where he mentions the fact that while entering such a type of experience, you may observe the light which is going to shine on the faces of the mystics. I shall bring again only a short quotation. Likewise today, it's a very important term, today, to say early 14th century, if someone will look at the faces of the students, he's speaking about the Kabbalists, who are worshipping out of love and for the sake of the Torah, who are very modest and pious, etc., you will see on them the radiance of the divine presence, so that those who see them will be afraid. And each of them will have the radiance of the divine presence in accordance to his rank. As to say, this experience was considered by the Kabbalists to be something that's much more corporeal, something that can be watched. It's not a matter of, let's say, assumption that after death someone will enter such an experience, but it's something almost corporeal which can be absorbed. A short comparison between the pattern of the ecstatic Neoplatonic type of Kabbalah with Maimonides may summarize the most quintessential features of this paradigm. For Maimonides, the experience was a mental one. It's nothing exterior. Someone may be in the Pardes, and no one will observe anything, because that's a matter of an inner state of consciousness, or almost a normal type of perfect philosophy. It has nothing to do with external expressions. For Maimonides, God is basically an intellect. For the ecstatic Kabbalah, God is basically a radiance, something that's half corporeal. For Maimonides, Adam was simply a perfect intellect. For the ecstatic Kabbalist, Adam was a creature of light. For Maimonides, paradise and Pardes were states of intellection. For the ecstatic Kabbalah, Pardes was a contemplation of light. Here we can see a move from the more cerebral, philosophical, abstract, if you like, paradigm to something that was much more corporeal, much more sensuous, erotic, if you like, sexual, and, in my opinion, also practical. Just to say, the Kabbalists, in order to enter such a type of experience, developed techniques. In Maimonides, it's very difficult to explain how do you reach the Pardes. The assumption is there's a supreme type of knowledge, but how exactly do you reach such a type of knowledge, no one knows, but by reading some books of mathematics, physics, music, astronomy, but how and when and what, I would say, the touchstone of the achievement of something like that, no one knows from Maimonides. The Kabbalists attempted to describe precise techniques and also external, I would say, signs for their attainment. This is why Kabbalah must be understood not merely speculation or speculations about mysticism, but mysticism in a full-fledged sense of the word. I assume that expressions found in some of the texts discussed here point to a very extreme type of experience which the Kabbalists were looking for and considered to be very positive. As I say, one of the descriptions of such an experience was Ma'ala Gdola. That's a high rank. As you say, the mystical death is not merely an accident during a mystical experience, but it's really the goal of ecstatic Kabbalah. Such a reading is corroborated also by other texts in ecstatic Kabbalah, where Ben Azai is not mentioned at all, and this idea, I would say, is related to other Jewish theologomena, to say, other types of Jewish proof texts. But in ecstatic Kabbalah, this type of mystical death is considered to be a very high attainment. In the case of Maimonides, it's hardly the situation. The idea is to remain in a state of intellection, of exercising your intellectual capacity. With the ecstatic Kabbalists, not with all the Kabbalists, but with the ecstatic Kabbalists, there's no doubt that an extreme experience is the extreme attainment, but also the final one. You cannot return all the time from such type of experience. Here you can see again how the Pardes was, I would say, utilized by Jewish mystics in order to infuse new ideals. This ideal of mystical life, of contemplation of light, of strong experience, used the Pardes story in a new manner, totally different from Maimonides. And it opened, I would say, another avenue in Jewish mysticism which was exploited mainly by 18th century Hasidic mysticism. I cannot enter here on the next lecture in this issue, but here we can see one continuous line from the very beginning of Kabbalah through 15th century, 16th century texts, paraphrasing our texts that can be shown philologically, up to the Besht, the founder of modern Hasidism, who quoted part of our text, and he interpreted it in a more Hasidic manner, but basically we can see one line of tradition which doesn't depend, in my opinion, on any historical vicissitude, and it can be understood as an inner Jewish development informed both by ancient mysticism and by pagan and maybe even Christian type of Neoplatonism. Thank you very much.